It seemed at the time impossible.
Has the most famous ship in the history of the world been discovered at last?
The Gilgamesh epic paralleled exactly the story of Noah in the Bible.
There is plenty of ancient historical evidence spanning nearly 2,000 years that the Ark is on Mount Ararat.
The location of the mystical Mount Sinai itself is the subject of relentless argument.
The biblical story of the burning bush is completely true and totally provable.
It must have seemed to Moses that God was asking him to do the impossible.
In the book of Matthew, we're told that the graves were opened and the bodies of many dead saints were raised to life.
During the night, all of Sennacherib's army had been struck down by some kind of plague.
Mary Magdalene was a woman of independent means and spirit.
For nearly 2,000 years, she's inspired millions of people, especially women.
The Grail is believed by many to be the cup containing the wine that Christ associated with his blood at the Last Supper. According to the legend, only Sir Galahad was able to reach it, dying in a moment of transcendental glory. The sound of pottery shattering caught his attention. The curiosity of the world was ignited.
The Dead Sea Scrolls date back almost 2,000 years.
Along with the many papyrus and leather scrolls was a scroll made of copper. As Herod's men attempted to open the tomb, a blast of flame filled the chamber and drove them back.
God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place.
And the stars of heaven fell into earth.
Fires are burning all over the city. Several plane crashes with countless calls keep coming in. Complete chaos is the only way I can describe the situation.
For the great day of his wrath is come.
It turns out that Bible prophecy has an unparalleled record of accuracy.
The focus of the conflict lies in the destiny of Jerusalem.
This will be the last great battle, and one in which God himself will eventually take part. You'll be amazed at what has been discovered.
Was there a creator who designed the earth and all that's on it as part of a master plan? Or did it simply fall into place by accident? Is the human species simply the byproduct of a cosmic chaos that randomly organized itself into what we know today as modern man? Or is there another answer? Is it possible that science and the Bible both provide clues to a third possibility? What are the archaeologists, paleontologists, biologists, and theologians saying today? Was the Garden of Eden the setting into which mankind was born? Is the story of Adam and Eve fact or fiction?
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
All right, lift off and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. God saw that it was good.
In December of 1968, science and religion came together in a magnificent spectacle of man's achievement. The astronauts of Apollo 8, the crowning scientific achievement of their day, celebrated the moment by radioing back to Earth those words from the first book of Genesis. It seems an appropriate gesture, since in a very real sense the Apollo represented a new beginning for humankind. Within a matter of months, an American astronaut would walk on the moon. But back on Earth, an ages-old argument was still brewing. Did God really create the heaven and earth? And was there an Adam and Eve, whose literal descendants had just performed the miraculous feat of sending men into space? The story of how the world was created and how mankind came to be is found in the first 2 books of Genesis in the Hebrew Torah, later incorporated into the Bible. These 2 small books had shaped the Judeo-Christian view of the earth and its beginnings for millennia, but by the middle of the 19th century, that view was being challenged. The story is set forth in the simplest of terms. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The 6 stages of creation are then described, concluding with the creation of man, Adam, and from Adam a woman who was called Eve. The Bible doesn't go into a great deal of detail about how everything was created, only that it was done and in a certain number of days. The Bible also makes it clear that all of this was accomplished by a creator, God, who apparently had some grand design and purpose for his creation. For some reason, he chose a man, Adam, and a woman, Eve, to help him accomplish that grand design. But is the story of Adam and Eve literally true?
Many people think that the story of Adam and Eve was a symbolic account or a legend or myth to explain the origin of people. However, the literature of the Bible treats Adam and Eve in the form of writing that is used for historical narratives. Adam and Eve, for example, are included in family trees. The setting in which they are made has real cities, real rivers that we know of from history. Now, if there are people who say, I don't believe it, but the Bible certainly introduces Adam and Eve as historical figures.
According to that historical narrative, the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. A little later in the narrative, the Lord decides it is not good for the man to be alone. So he caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man. This seems to complete the creation narrative in the first chapter of Genesis, in which God simply tells us that he created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. All of this, by the way, happened in a rather well-defined place called the Garden of Eden. We are told God planted it in the east, and that a river flowed from it that was separated into 4 headwaters. One was called a Pishon, that wandered through the entire land of Havilah. The second was called Gihon, and it wound its way through the land of Cush. The third river was the Tigris, running along the east side of the Asher, and the fourth was the river Euphrates. 2 of those rivers we know of today, or at least we know of 2 rivers in the Middle East with the names Tigris and Euphrates. If we can pinpoint the location of the Garden of Eden, does that bring us closer to an understanding of the role of Adam and Eve in the history of mankind? Several different people claim to have found the Garden of Eden, but they disagree on its location. Is it possible that there's more than one spot on Earth that fits the biblical roadmap? And can we ever know which locale is the genuine article? Eden North and Eden South. That's how the 2 leading theories for the location of the Garden of Eden might be described. One camp says that paradise on earth was located in the northern part of the ancient world. The other insists that it's thousands of miles to the south, and they've got the satellite images to prove it. Could it be that one of these factions has actually found the Garden of Eden? Both claim to be using the same biblical documentation to pinpoint its location. So why do they disagree? And how do these theories stack up against the ancient evidence?
The location of the Garden of Eden is defined by the rivers that flow from and around it. Genesis chapter 2 tells us that a river watering the garden flowed from Eden, and there it divided into 4 headwaters. Now, each of these rivers is mentioned in the biblical text: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Now, the names of the 4 rivers would seem to give us the precise geographical location of the Garden of Eden. All you have to do is find the location of the start of these 4 rivers, and you found the garden.
How could anyone find the Garden of Eden when 2 of the 4 landmark rivers are missing? For thousands of years, it was an impossible task. But in recent years, satellite technology has spawned much more serious searches for the fabled paradise. What clues can we glean from this heavenly view of the earth? And will they be enough to lead us to the Garden of Eden?
The Bible makes some qualifying statements about where these 4 rivers of Eden are located. Especially interesting are the descriptions of the 2 lost rivers. First of all, the Pishon is said to have flowed around the entire land of Havilah, and the Bible tells us that Havilah has great natural resources in the form of gold, onyx, and bdellium. This is an aromatic resin similar to myrrh. The ancients regarded it almost as valuable as gold.
In searching for the location of the Garden of Eden, researchers have to use all the clues available to them. So locating the land the Bible calls Havilah is key. Biblical archaeologists believe Havilah is located in western Saudi Arabia. Here we find one of the richest and longest producing gold mines in the world, known as the Cradle of Gold because it was first mined in early biblical times. In fact, some Bible scholars point to this operation as the most likely candidate for King Solomon's mine. The problem with locating the land of Havilah in western Saudi Arabia is the fact that today the area is one big scorching desert without any apparent traces of rivers having existed there. At least that's what researchers believed until Landsat images taken from space allowed them to make a startling discovery. A world-famous geologist from Boston University, Farouk Elbaz, examined these images and discovered clear evidence of an extinct river, which he named the Kuwait River because at one time it flowed across northern Arabia and reached all the way to Kuwait. So now we've got an extinct river, an area that's rich in gold, and that same area has the natural resources to produce bdellium, just like the Bible says it should. Based on this evidence, some scholars assert that the Kuwait River was probably the Pishon River named in Genesis. Another clue the Bible gives us to the location of Eden concerns the second lost river, that is the Gihon, which is said to wind through the land of Cush. In the 17th century, translators of the King James Bible equated the biblical land of Cush with the ancient region of northeast Africa known as Cush. But a recent discovery casts doubt on this conclusion. In fact, many Bible scholars now believe that the King James translators made a mistake, and the name of the land where the Gihon River flowed is actually Kashu. If this is true, then we're really onto something, because Kashu is a land archaeologists can identify. It belonged to a people called the Kashites, who conquered Mesopotamia in about 1500 BC, and we know that ancient Mesopotamia is located in present-day Iraq. Based on this new identification of the land of Cush, many scholars have concluded that the Gihon River of the Bible is probably the Karun River of today. The Karun's course begins in Iran and flows southwesterly toward the Persian Gulf. So, if all the clues are put together, some scholars conclude that the Garden of Eden must have been located somewhere at the head of the Persian Gulf at a time when all 4 rivers joined and flowed through that area. With the discovery of the extinct Pishon River in Saudi Arabia and the identification of the Gihon River in present-day Iran, all the pieces of the Eden puzzle have fallen into place. But, although the approximate location of the garden has been found, we're no closer to actually seeing it than we were before. The reason being that climate changes have caused the waters of the Persian Gulf to rise since biblical times. And that means the area where the garden was located has been overtaken by the sea.
Could it be that the real Garden of Eden is tucked away in a remote corner of the earth, and has one man gone back in time to find it?
Apart from the story in Genesis, we do have traditions from outside the Bible. including the Babylonians and Sumerians, who mention a magical land beyond the mountains to the north.
Could the legends of ancient cultures lead us to the authentic location of the Garden of Eden? In April of 1997, archaeologist David Roll set out to find the lost paradise using information gleaned from Sumerian clay tablets that are more than 5,000 years old.
There's a very ancient epic poem entitled En-Merkar and the Lord of Aratta. Now this place Aratta, which En-Merkar's vizier goes to, is beyond the mountains. It's probably the biblical Ararat, the place where Noah's Ark came to rest. And this place, this Aratta, also has a plain. The Sumerian word is Edin, which is the biblical Eden. The Edin is a Sumerian word. It means plain, open land, uncultivated land. It's the sort of thing you would imagine for an Adam and Eve type situation, where we don't have real cultivation at this time. En-Merkar is the king of Uruk, and this is in southern Iraq today. And his envoy is sent across the mountains, the Zagros Mountains, to a place called Aratta, north of the mountains. And he brings messages from the king of Uruk, En-Merkar. So in fact, he's the first postman in history. Diplomatic relations between Uruk and Aratta weren't going too well. In fact, after about 15 years of arguments between the two kings, En-Merkar eventually invaded Aratta and brought back gold and semi-precious stones to adorn a temple in Uruk. And of course, Eden itself was rich in gold and semi-precious stones. The envoy's journey from Uruk to Aratta involved crossing through 7 gates. Now these gates are like mountain passes or gorges through the mountains. So you're crossing 7 mountain ranges to reach Aratta and therefore Eden. Now this may be similar to what we call the Hebrew tradition of the 7 heavens. And when you reach the 7th heaven, of course, you're in paradise.
How could the Garden of Eden be located in the mountains of western Iran? After all, satellite photos have led other experts to place the biblical paradise thousands of miles away. 4 major rivers can be found in this remote corner of western Iran. They include the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Aras, and the Uizun. While 2 of the 4 names fit the biblical roadmap, the other 2 names bear little resemblance to those of the lost rivers of the Bible. Is it possible for these modern waterways to be linked with the Pishon and Gihon rivers of Eden?
Looking for the Gihon River is rather difficult. The name doesn't exist today in the modern topography of the region. However, when the Islamic invasion took place in the 8th century AD, they came across a river which we call the Aras today, and they identified as the Gaihun, and this may well be the Hebrew Gihon. 100 years ago, if you looked at encyclopedias, you would have seen the name Gaihun or Gihon Aras.
How is it possible that scholars of the 19th century made the connection between these 2 rivers, while 20th century scholars seem to have missed it? More importantly, are there additional clues to Eden's whereabouts hidden in Victorian-era publications?
Victorian scholars were aware of a land called Kosseia, a classical Kosseia, which was in the land area of Azerbaijan, and through it flowed the Aras River. And this is identified then with the land of Kush, same as Kosseia, through which the Gihon flowed. So the Gihon Aras is the biblical Gihon flowing through the land of Kush.
Were Victorian scholars correct in placing the land of Kush in modern-day Azerbaijan? And is there any evidence that the name Kush has survived to this day?
The book of Genesis tells us that the Garden of Eden is in the east of Eden, in other words, within the boundaries of the land of Eden. And to the east of our area is a very fertile valley, surrounded by high mountain peaks. Now this valley is bordered on the northern side by a mountain ridge called Kush-Adag, and Kush-Adag in the modern language means the mountain of Kush, and Kush is the land beyond to the north of this valley. Identifying the Gihon is a breeze compared to trying to find the Pishon, the 4th river. Now we don't have any rivers in this region with that similar sounding name. However, the 4th major river in the mountain area here is called the Kezel Uizan, which means the long gold in Iranian. Now we think this name Uizan may be the original Iranian version of the biblical Pishon. The only difference is the letters U and P have been interchanged. So we get from Uizan to Pishon or Pishon. Chapter 2 of Genesis tells us very clearly that 4 of the headwaters or sources of 4 great rivers from the region start out in Eden. So all you have to do is actually trace the rivers back to their sources, and there you are in Eden. So why hasn't anybody thought of this before? This fourth river of Eden, the Pishon, flowed through the land of Havilah. On a modern map, this would be Angaran province in western Iran. And this area is indeed rich in gold and semi-precious stones, just as Havilah was rich in gold and semi-precious stones. The name Kezel Uizon, the river, means the golden Uizon, or in the biblical terms, the golden Pishon, and in this area there are many ancient gold mines. The land of Eden is a vast area, but Genesis 2 tells us specifically that the Garden of Eden is in the east of Eden, in other words, within Eden, but in the eastern part, and that's where you have to look for Adam's garden. We have to realize that the Garden of Eden is a natural place. It's not an artificial garden. The Hebrew words Gan Eden mean a walled garden, but it's not an artificial type of garden. We must envisage a natural space, perhaps a valley surrounded by high mountains. And the Greek word paradise, paradisa, coming from the Persian, also means a royal parkland or enclosed hunting ground. So both ideas tell us that we should be looking for a valley surrounded by high mountains. This valley of the garden is a remarkable place. It's bounded on its west side by a great lake, Lake Urmia, with its marshes. The valley itself is long and thin, running from west to east. Through it flows a beautiful river, which comes down from the mountains. To the south and to the north are high peaks protecting the valley, and to the east a pass which leads out of the garden towards a place called Nukti in the local language, which means belonging to Nukt, and Nukt could be the biblical nod. Climatologists have worked out that this area was very much lusher in the ancient times, several thousand years ago. The valley itself was protected. It had a sort of microclimate with warm winds coming in from the west. So it was very, very fertile, lots and lots of water, lots of areas to grow plants and to cultivate. This really was a paradise on earth.
As we've seen, there's more than one X that marks the spot of the treasure man has sought for thousands of years. Will we ever be able to determine which of these locations, if any, was the actual Garden of Eden?
Adam and Eve belong to the same space-time history to which we belong ourselves. They are in principle datable, although we haven't got the information to fix their date. They are in principle locatable, although we haven't got the information to tell us just where in the Middle East the Garden of Eden was. But they are the parents of the human race. The idea of a primitive pair is the only idea that makes sense in terms of biology.
The story of Adam and Eve is, in every sense, the story of beginnings. The beginning of the human race, of course, but it is also the beginning of all human emotion. Sin and suffering, sex and rebellion, fear, parenthood, and love all have their beginning with Adam and Eve. According to some experts, the pattern for every great love story throughout history can be found in the lifelong commitment of Adam and Eve. But is this a story that is acceptable in the modern world? Is it a myth made up of false hopes and ideas, or could it be literally true?
Modern science has pretty well accepted the Adam and Eve idea. The research shows us that indeed there was an Adam and Eve in the history of man. The problem for most of us and most scientists is the story of Eve being created from a rib of Adam, the idea that a part of his body was provided to mold her out. The biblical story in the original Hebrew scriptures does not tell us that story. It tells us that God went and fetched Eve as a complete woman and brought her to Adam for the purposes of betrothal, marriage, and establishing the family.
The myth of Adam and Eve is not either true or false. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. It's a myth, by which I mean it's a story to explain to the people of that time and that geographical area where they came from and why they're there and so on. That's what the Bible is. It's a series of stories and myths. So to ask if it's true or false is not the right question. I think, what does it mean to those people?
To millions of people over a period of several millennia, the story of Adam and Eve has meant a kinship with their Creator. It is a story that provides an answer to not only how it all began, but also how it will end, with an opportunity for redemption in between. But in the last century and a half, that view has come under attack.
According to a well-known Dr. George Wald, who taught
at the University of Harvard. He said there are only two possibilities when it comes to creation: spontaneous generation, which was disproved over 100 years ago, or that there is the supernatural. We do not believe in the supernatural, therefore we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose by chance.
Some facts are self-evident, like the fact that human beings are here and apparently have been for some considerable amount of time. How we got here is another matter. Could it be that chance plays a major role in creation?
To have a creation, you must have a creator. To have things made, there must be a maker. That's why the Bible says the fool has said in his heart, there's no God.
So, if chance plays no part in creation, and the story of Adam and Eve is suspect, where do we look for answers? For many, the Bible is simply accepted and no further proof is necessary. But there is another notion that calls into question virtually everything the Bible says. It is called evolution. Will we find Adam and Eve among the fossilized remains of long-dead and extinct species? Have there been scientific discoveries that prove evolution correct? Or is it the biblical account that stands up under scientific scrutiny? Or is there another possibility? The Bible tells us that God created man in his own image, both male and female. Evolutionists dispute this. In fact, this is the core of the argument.
There's no question that humans have been one of the most dominant species that has ever lived on Earth during the 3.5 billion years of the history of life here on Earth. Like all of those other life forms that live on Earth, though, we share that 3.5 billion years of history. From a biological standpoint, humans are really no more successful than is an animal such as the opossum. We all have our ecological roles in the evolutionary play. However, humans have developed technology, language, culture that allow us to adapt to many, many different circumstances than does the opossum. We are specialists here on this earth.
The Western view of man is always held that man is here for a purpose, and that purpose is to know God. To define mankind as nothing more only destroys the basis for the human family. How can anybody have a purpose in life if they believe and are taught that they are just a random chance accident and all they have to look forward to is death?
At the heart of the controversy is this man, Charles Darwin. As a young naturalist, Darwin observed that the flora and fauna of the Galapagos Islands were of a singularly strange and unique nature. But Darwin saw much more than oddities of the plant and animal kingdom. Darwin's observations led him to a re-examination of the very origins of life itself. These observations were published in 1859 in his now famous work on the origin of the species. Is it possible that Darwin stumbled on the answer unwittingly?
In 1859, the English naturalist Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. That was the first modern version of evolution, and evolution means change over time of living creatures. And the story begins with very simple groups of molecules and going all the way up to the most complex of all creatures, and those are human beings, trees, elephants, whatever. It is believed that these chemicals came together in some remarkable way to produce things such as amino acids, nucleic acids, fatty acids, and other substances characteristic of life. And eventually, from these simple beginnings, single cells were formed, and eventually the rest of evolution occurred.
These concepts of evolution have become so well established over the past 100 years that virtually every element of society is touched by some aspect of the theory. Schools from elementary grades to universities, museums, national parks, news and entertainment publications all showcase the theory of evolution as if it were scientific fact. But in reality, evolution after 150 years is still not accepted by all scientists as even a viable theory.
The entire controversy seems to have resolved itself into these two concepts. Mankind was either an accident brought about by natural processes or the purposeful work of an intelligent creator. But are these the only possibilities? Aren't there some clues in the archaeological and fossil records?
You know, if evolution really occurred, it occurred in the past. And we ought to see some evidence that it occurred in the millions of fossils that we see in our universities and museums around the world. The fossil record, that's the record of life in the past. But when we look at the fossil record, we see no clue that any basic type of animal changed into another basic type. We see a lot of variety within the basic types, but no transitional forms between the types.
Many evolutionists argue that transitional forms are absent because of erosion, which makes the data incomplete. And that explanation explains the presence of gaps in the fossil data, but it doesn't explain the absence of ancestors, lineages, and continuity, ancestor-descendant continuity in the data, and that's a central issue today. Evolutionists try to explain the presence of large gaps in the fossil record by saying that evolution happened in rapid bursts, all of a sudden. And that is really just a story that is unsupported by experimental evidence today. What we see today is that evolution happens very slowly, if at all, and within very limited boundaries.
Even Darwin admitted that his own theory was worthless speculation without the all-important fossil proof of transitional forms.
It was Archaeopteryx, a fossil found in Bavaria, that was intermediate in many of its structures between reptiles and birds. A typical reptilian characteristic was the long, bony tail, absent in modern birds, and teeth. The striking feature that made it like a bird was the presence of wings and feathers. Careful study by paleontologists confirmed that Archaeopteryx was almost a perfect intermediate between reptiles and birds. And so, in a very real sense, this was positive proof of the correctness of Darwin's idea of evolution.
The favorite example that my evolutionary colleagues usually give for transitional forms is the creature called Archaeopteryx, and it's supposedly the link between reptiles and birds. But you know, there's been a fossil found here recently of a bird that is 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. So obviously, Archaeopteryx couldn't be the ancestor of birds. Actually, the evidence is such that evolutionists can't agree on how reptiles evolved into birds. And they certainly don't all agree that Archaeopteryx was the ancestor. The transitional forms that they need simply are not there. But that doesn't stop them. You go to any textbook on evolution, and there's Archaeopteryx, as if it were proof that reptiles evolved into birds.
One of the frustrating things to creationists is the unqualified acceptance of evolution as a fact. Lacking any credible evidence at all, the evolutionists resort to artwork. Fish magically grow legs, extinct hyrax-like creatures similar to dwarf deer mysteriously turn into horses, and apes become human. Models of non-existent animals magically appear in museum exhibits. These representations are pure speculation, but the computers can make them look very real. Even the National Academy of Sciences, official advisor to the United States government on questions of science, has falsely claimed in official publications that the missing link is no longer missing.
But if there is nothing in the fossil record to support the theory of macroevolution, is there anything in the record that supports the idea of Adam and Eve? If science is to be the final judge, is there a creation science? Can evolution be called science?
We find that evolution does not agree with science in some very important physical laws. For example, we have the first law of thermodynamics, which says that neither matter nor energy can be created or destroyed, just changed back and forth. But then we have the law of general relativity that says there was a beginning of time and space and matter. How do you reconcile the two? Well, the Bible says very clearly that God created in the beginning and he rested at the end of creation. Therefore, general relativity is supported, and the first law of thermodynamics is also supported.
The Leakey family have been very famous in their support for evolution. But in a major interview, Richard Leakey, had a line drawing showing how a human and our ape-like ancestors supposedly came together, but at the bottom there was a big question mark. In fact, the Leakey family have done a good job of finding human remains below the level of some of our supposed ape-like ancestors.
But if the paleontology trail goes nowhere, what about archaeology? Haven't there been discoveries of man-like creatures? What about Piltdown Man, Java Man, and just about every student has heard or read about the Neanderthal man. These discoveries were all hailed at one time as proof that Darwin was right. Has science confirmed these findings? For nearly 150 years, various scientific disciplines have waged a vigorous and unyielding war on the fundamental concepts taught in the book of Genesis. Could it be that today the assumptions of the evolutionists are being questioned not just by creationists, but by other scientists as well? Dr. Arthur C. Custance, a Ph.D. in anthropology, is the author of the 10-volume Doorway Papers. He was a fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute and a member of the New York Academy of Sciences.
So basic are these erroneous assumptions that the whole theory is maintained in spite of, rather than because of, the evidence. It has become, in the strictest sense, irrational, yet concepts which challenge the theory are almost never given a fair hearing.
But if the basic tenets of the theory of evolution are so easily dismissed by prominent scientists, how could it be that these ideas and concepts have taken such a firm hold on 20th century thinking? What are we missing here?
One of the reasons the theory of evolution became so popular is the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925. This trial pitted William Jennings Bryan against Clarence Darrow in a classic confrontation regarding the teaching of evolution in schools.
The paradox that happened during the Scopes trial was that the creationist won. The evolutionary teacher, John Scopes, was convicted and fined, but because of the way the media presented it, it looked like they had more information and they were more acceptable than the creationists, who were made to look like they were imbeciles, like they knew nothing about science. And so from that point on, our society began to accept evolution as a valid thought. And that's how we came to where we are today, where it has taken over in the schools, it has taken over in the public for the most part, because of the way the media slanted it way back then in 1925.
Was the Scopes trial the watershed so far as evolution was concerned? Weren't there other findings? Archaeologists have claimed for years that they have been digging up the remains of early versions of man all over the globe.
In 1922, Harold Cook found a tooth in Sioux County, Nebraska, right near the Colorado border. He thought it looked to him like it was halfway between a human tooth and an ape's tooth, and so he thought, wow, I found the missing link. He built an entire skeleton based on this one tooth, and then built a guy a wife, also based on the same tooth, and was going to use it as evidence in the Scopes monkey trial as proof for evolution. And it turned out later the tooth actually came from a pig. So a Nebraska man was a fraud. The Piltdown Man was a deliberate hoax. It was a human skull and an ape's jawbone that they filed down to make them fit together, treated them with acid. It fooled the experts for 40 years because what happened, they made castings of these, like this one I'm holding in my hand. This is a casting, actually just plaster, and so you cannot tell where the seams are, what was actual bone, what was clay filled in. The original is locked in a vault someplace under armed guard where nobody ever gets to see that, or very, very rarely. And so for 40 years, the Piltdown hoax was in our textbooks as evidence for evolution. The Neanderthal skeletons that are used as evidence for evolution today are just humans deformed from old age or rickets or arthritis. When the first one was found, the back was bent over, and since man walks upright and apes walk on four legs, somebody thought, wow, this is a missing link, halfway between the two. And it's just an old man with arthritis.
But certainly the quest continues. What do new discoveries and new studies reveal about early human remains? Is Neanderthal man still being studied?
It appears that anthropologists have made a concerted effort to adhere to a rigid uniformitarian viewpoint concerning the aging and growth of ancient populations, despite evidence to the contrary. For example, the Gibraltar II child's skull and jaw bones were never allowed to speak for themselves. When we set aside the evolutionary dogma, we find that we have remarkable evidence for a child who matured late and aged slowly, consistent with the long lifespans written about in the Bible. The evidence points towards Neanderthals being post-flood people, certainly not people who lived prior to Noah's flood.
Could it be that anthropologists, in search of supporting data for the theory of evolution, have actually unearthed data that supports the biblical record? What about the widely publicized find affectionately named Lucy? Where does she fit in the evolutionary scale?
As you know, Lucy was found in 1974, and sometimes I refer to her as the woman who shook up man's family tree, because she represents for us the oldest, most complete skeleton we have of any human ancestor known to anthropologists.
Actually, Lucy was very chimpanzee-like. She stood 3 feet 6 inches tall, had a chimp-sized brain and chimp-like teeth. She was a chimp. The only features that even hint toward human ancestry were her hips and knee joints, and these gave a hint toward erect posture. But even these are very controversial among evolutionists.
She comes closer to representing, I think, what the average person thinks of as the missing link than any other fossil we had ever found in Africa. So she has extraordinary importance in terms of understanding the very earliest phases of human evolution.
Charles Oxnard, the British scientist, is probably the world's leading expert on Lucy. He spent 16 years studying every bone, doing a computer analysis of each, the dimensions of all the bones, and said, folks, it's not a missing link. It's just an unusual monkey.
But haven't there been other fossil discoveries that have gained great notoriety over the years as ancestors of modern man?
Another so-called missing link, Java man, was concocted by Eugene Dubois when he found an ape-like skull fragment and then 50 feet away a human leg bone. However, just before he died, Dubois confessed that he also found 2 human skulls at the same location, and he admitted that the skull fragment belonged to a gibbon, not an ape man.
The prestigious National Geographic magazine in May 2000 headlined an article on new paleontological findings as the dawn of humans. This 2-million-year-old hominid skull, the article says, is the most complete of its kind yet found, a large-jawed proto-human that became extinct on a side branch of the human family tree. We're left to wonder how an extinct species so dissimilar to humans could possibly be evidence of the dawn of humans, or even proto-humans for that matter.
Apparently, the frantic search for missing links has resulted in a number of mistakes and even fraud. Unfortunately, some of those mistakes are still perpetuated today. Java man, for example, is still referred to in some texts as the beginnings of Homo erectus. But if the fossil record is incomplete or just plain scientifically unsatisfactory, where does that leave us? Where can we look next? Is there an explanation for the gap in the fossil record? Could it be that there was an Adam and Eve, but we've been looking in the wrong place? Is there some kind of evidence for the origins of man in the more modern DNA or genetic sciences? Is it possible that if the missing link cannot be found buried under the Earth's strata, Adam and Eve might be found under the lens of a microscope? Someone once wrote that the formula for evolution was really quite simple. Nothing plus nobody times flying chance equals everything. That was probably said in jest, but in reality, the very serious concept of spontaneous generation is in fact quite similar. This proposition suggests that chemicals plus time equals life, all life. But is either proposition scientifically supportable?
One of the fundamental laws in biology is biogenesis, that life comes only from pre-existing life. Now that's a great encouragement to people who believe in creation, But I began my college teaching career as an evolutionist, convinced that chemicals put together life without any outside help at all. Science has convinced me that just won't work. In fact, death might be defined as the triumph of chemistry over biology. When molecules begin to do what comes naturally for them, the result is death, not life. Chemistry may help us understand how we return to dust. It could never explain how we came from dust in the first place.
A number of scientists have tried to calculate the mathematical probability of life arising by chance. Sir Fred Hoyle, a British mathematician, estimated the mathematical probability of the 2,000 proteins in an amoeba arising by chance. He estimated the probability of that happening to be 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power. Clearly a mathematical impossibility.
The probability of 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power is a number so ridiculously small that Sir Frederick Hoyle was forced to conclude that, quote, "It is enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor any other, and if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence," end quote.
The problem with evolutionism is that it has order coming out of chaos. That simply doesn't happen. Science can produce no parallels. Evolutionism is bad science and bad philosophy.
But if that's the case, our investigation so far has been fruitless, no pun intended. The Garden of Eden has not been found, and according to a number of scholars in various fields, evolution is untenable. Are these the only possibilities? Or could it be, as the evolutionists believe, we are here simply because we beat the odds? And if that's the case, how can we account for the gaps in the fossil record? There is now a new conceptualization of the evolutionary process that addresses that problem. It doesn't replace the idea of a primordial soup and all life commencing from nothing, but it does have some interesting implications for the Darwinian concept of natural selection. It's called punctuated equilibria.
In contrast to the slow and gradual form of evolution originally proposed, to cover up the fact that the fossil record didn't fit that form, Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard and Niles Eldridge of the American Museum in New York proposed in the early 70s a method or a model of evolution called punctuated equilibria. It suggested vast periods of stasis or equilibrium, no change in the fossil record of individual forms, and then sudden upward changes to a new variety or new species over relatively short periods of time. But that didn't fit the record either, because in either case, transitional forms are needed, and they are not existing.
Let me see if I have this right. The reason we cannot see it happening in the fossil record is because it's happening too fast. And the reason why we cannot see it happening in the fossil record today is because it's happening too slow, or possibly it never happened at all.
The theory has been around now for nearly 2 decades and is probably as controversial today within the scientific community as it was when it was first proposed. In the introduction to their book, the authors point out that, quote, "Our several distinguished biologists are unable to agree on a common definition of the constituent elements of punctuated equilibrium." On the same page, Dr. Anthony Hoffman identifies 3 versions of the theory as entirely trivial, blatantly false, and empirically untestable. Yet the theory does have its supporters.
A new and better understanding of evolution has emerged in recent years, known as punctuated equilibria. And this contrasts a notion of a gradual change over time with the fact that quite frequently in major groups of organisms there is a rapid change in the varieties present, followed by a long period of which there is little or no change.
I think that this whole idea of punctuated equilibrium, it's nothing more than a desperate attempt to salvage evolution theory.
Punctuated equilibria is hardly the last gasp of evolutionary scientists to understand the changes that we see in organisms through time in the fossil record. Punctuated equilibria allows us to understand gaps in the fossil record. It's one hypothesis among many that helps us to explain change through time.
Dr. Stephen J. Gould, professor at Harvard University, and Dr. Niles Eldridge, the curator of the American Museum of Natural History, have developed a notion that, in the simplest terms, suggests that somewhere in the distant past, a lizard laid an egg and a fully developed bird hatched out and flew away. And it happened so fast the species didn't leave any geologic trace or any evidence of transitional forms. It seems that almost every new development in science is converging to destroy evolution.
Is that true? Are new scientific disciplines and studies blowing holes in evolutionist ideas? Among the best known of these new disciplines are the fairly recent scientific developments in the fields of genetics and DNA. Can their contribution to the argument help resolve the controversy?
One of the more amusing things you hear these days is that the DNA of man and chimpanzees is something like 98% identical. As a geneticist, I can tell you, you're not even that closely related to yourself. The DNA you inherit from your mother, the DNA you inherit from your father are at best about 93% similar. But think for a minute about a cloud. A cloud is 98% water. Watermelon's 98% water. Jellyfish is 98% water. Using the logic of an evolutionist, you'd have to say there's no difference between a watermelon, a cloud, and a jellyfish. Yeah, we know there are big differences. Suppose there were only a 2% difference. If that 2% DNA told the other 98% what to do, wow, what a difference there would be. In fact, we're so special that each one of us has our own unique DNA fingerprint.
As a practical matter, we can say that neither the human nor the chimp DNA has been anywhere near fully sequenced, so a proper comparison can hardly be made. But have DNA studies yielded any results in the scientific quest to discover the real Adam and Eve?
The data on DNA has been very helpful in showing that all people came from one woman we might call Eve, but the date has always been controversial. Back in 1987, a group out at Berkeley suggested that the differences may have arisen over 100 to 200,000 years. But more recently, scientists have discovered that DNA in mitochondria changes about 20 times faster than previously assumed. In 1998, a study was done that showed that changes in mitochondrial DNA occur more than 20 times faster than previously assumed. It now looks as if Eve may have lived just 6,000 years ago.
And what about Adam? Are there any genetic clues?
When we look at the DNA of mitochondria, we can trace our female ancestor all back to one woman called mitochondrial Eve. Well, scientists said, let's try it with the father. We can take the Y chromosome, which men have and women don't, and sure enough, we all come from one father, and it's common to call that first father Adam. But here's the problem. Originally, when they did the dates for the first woman and the first man, they were about 100,000 years apart. Now talk about sitting around on a Saturday night waiting for the phone to ring. That doesn't look like that would really work. Fortunately, new evidence has brought those dates much closer to the present time. Well-known evolutionist at Berkeley once said that it looks like there are very few differences among human beings. As he put it, we all got off the same boat not so very long ago. I think he may have said a lot more than he really intended.
Could it be that modern science is confirming that Adam and Eve are indeed a fact of life? At the moment, only one thing seems certain. The argument between creationists and evolutionists is far from over, and neither side shows any signs of retreating from their position. Still, the pendulum of knowledge and understanding is never at rest, and for the moment at least, it seems to be swinging back toward an interpretation compatible with the Genesis account.
let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. God saw that it was good.
Perhaps the renowned modern astronomer Robert Jastrow had it right after all when he said, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries."